Hey everybody, I hope y'all are having a fantastic week this week. As we come to the end of our study in the book of John, we're going to be finishing up today with John chapter 21. Now here in John chapter 21, we start to see Jesus appearing to his disciples and then kind of talking a little bit more about the things that are going to happen. This is kind of one of the last times that he appears to his disciples where it's just their disciples by themselves. And we're really going to see some things in this passage that really kind of set up, because remember last time we looked in chapter 20, we started to see some of the disciples were doubting, and then we start to see here where some of the disciples are out, they're out going about their business, and we'll see what happens here in chapter 21. So first off, we'll read John chapter 21, and we'll begin reading verse 1 to 14. So John 21, 1 to 14. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on one side of the boat, on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." And they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "Is it the Lord?" When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came to the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far off land, but about 100 yards off. When they got on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid out on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Break some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many that the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was the third time that Jesus was revealed to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So here we see this encounter with Jesus that the disciples had. So it's interesting. We see that, Jesus is Lord of our lives, and he wants some things as a part of that, right? He wants to have that relationship with us. He wants to have that friendship with him. And so we see that, as part of Jesus we have friendship with other people. And that's what we see here. Some of the disciples, they were out. It wasn't all the disciples. It was some of the disciples went out. 7 of the disciples went out and decided to go fishing. So Peter goes, he says, I'm going to go fishing. Now, it's interesting, like I said, here we don't know what the purpose of this was, what the purpose of him going fishing was. Was it just kind of relive old times and remember the time he was a fisherman? Was it for him going back and possibly, after knowing Jesus was going to be raised from the dead, was going to be ascending back into heaven soon, that he was going to go back to fishing? We don't know, but we got to remember that there were some of the disciples were fishermen. That was where they were most comfortable. That was their career that they had chosen. So it's interesting that they decided to go out and go fishing, right? So we don't know. Maybe it was just for fun, but we see this here. So Jesus, we have this friendship with Jesus, and Jesus was their friend, right? Jesus was a close friend to the disciples. He cared about them. He loved them so much. He was with them all the time. And it's kind of interesting we see this. And then, Jesus wants, followership. He wants us to follow him. And that's what we see here. And it's interesting that we look in this passage and we really see some things that go on, some things that are happening. And we see that while the disciples are out, they go out, and these are supposedly professional fishermen, and they catch nothing. They don't catch a single fish all night. Can you imagine, not catching a single fish all night, right? And you were a professional fisherman. That would be embarrassing. It would be utterly embarrassing for them. So they go out, and so they go out at night. Now, whenever we picture fishing boats these huge fishing boats that can hold thousands and thousands and thousands of fish, right? That, are, 50, 60, 70, 80, maybe 100 feet long, 20 or so feet wide, and have all these cranes and all these hoists and all these things to pull fish in. That's kind of like what we picture today, because that's what fishing boats are today. But back then, they were very small. They were maybe about 3 to 4 foot wide and maybe about 20 feet long. And that was all the fishing boats were. They were small fishing boats that went out, fished, and then came back. So their nets weren't prepared for the amount of fish that they were going to catch. So the disciples, they're out all night fishing, right? They're out fishing, they're out struggling, they're out smelling like fish, because guess what? Fish stink, right? We all know fish stinks. So they're out there. So then they see this person on the land. They don't know who it is. They don't recognize him because they're a bit away. It says here they're 100 yards away. I mean, just imagine that's 300 feet. It's 300 feet, right? It's hard for you sometimes to see and recognize someone at 300 feet. Just think about someone at the opposite end of the football field. You may be able to do it. You may not. But we also don't know if there was fog or other things there that would have prevented them from seeing it. But they saw this person on shore. To see them and recognize, maybe, but something miraculous happens, and which is where if they're about 100 yards away from the shore, then they hear somebody. Now, I know that I can project and that I can yell and I can be heard from a long way ways. But 300 feet to be heard clearly and be able to understand is insane if you think about it. Because they would have been yelling back and forth to each other. The person shore would have been yelling, "Hey, did you catch anything?" And the disciples on the boat would have said, "No, we haven't caught anything." And then the other person said, "Well, throw it to the net on the other side." That would have been a back and forth, but it would have been from, like I said, 100 yards away. 300 feet away. That's a long distance. Now, here's the thing too, is that we got to realize is because it's Jesus, right? It's Jesus there, and we know that. Maybe he was able to project his voice, and because we know he could do things that we can't do. He can perform miracles that we can't perform, and all these things. And so, we have to remember that. And so maybe he was able to, talk to them like they're here back and forth. So, that's what we may think. But he wants followership. And we see that here is that these disciples, they don't sit there and say, "Oh man, this dude's crazy. We've been fishing all night. There's no way there's any fish just on the other side of the boat." Because we're not talking about, like I said, 30, 40 feet. We're talking about maybe 4 or 5 feet at the most. So they cast the nets on the other side of the boat. And they have more fish that they can carry, because it looks like, it says the net was about to break, that it was overloading. Right? They hauled the net ashore full of 153 fish, 153 large fish. We don't know what they mean. I mean, they probably weren't like minnows, but I mean, they probably may have been like, who knows, about maybe like this long, or, we don't know, right? We don't know, because we don't know the type of fish or anything like that. But that's not important. But it was so much that it was hard for them. They couldn't pull it in. They weren't strong enough to pull in 153 fish into the boat so that they could have it. So Jesus wanted their followership. So they followed him. And here's the interesting thing. We start to see here is that whenever it says the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's talking about John. So John is there with him. And so he says he sees him afar off. He says, "Is that Jesus?" And then it's like Peter does it. Peter, once again, I've always said this, and I keep saying it. I'm not keep on meaning to say it. But Peter is either always on fire for Jesus, or he's completely denying Jesus, it seems like. Because you got to remember, 2 chapters ago, he cut off the guard's ear that came to arrest him, one of the guard's ear. And then later on that night, a couple hours later, he denied Christ 3 times. Well, now here he is again. Instead of waiting to get to the shore with everyone else with the boat to help him get there, he decides to jump into the water and swim 100 yards to shore. So it's really, crazy. It's kind of like, it would be kind of like making 2 laps, a lap forward and a lap back in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It would have taken him, not a huge amount of time, but It would have taken him some time to get there because he's not like Michael Phelps or, Katie Ledecky, all these fast swimmers in the Olympics. And so we really start to see that and really start to see that Jesus was there. And so they get there, and then he comes, and then we kind of see this shift when they got to the fish. He wanted to go from followership, from them following him, his commands, to throw the net on the other side, to that he wants to have fellowship with his disciples. He wants to have fellowship with his disciples. He wants to have morning breakfast with them. So they get to the shore, and there's already this coal fire that's burning that has fish and bread on it. And so Jesus tells them to bring some more bread over here. One of the interesting things in this passage, let me get to this real quick before I forget. One of the interesting things in this passage, it looks like it says, none of them asked who it was, because they knew he was Jesus. They knew who it was. They knew who it was. And so they didn't ask who it was, what he was doing there, why he was doing this. None of that stuff. He didn't ask any of that stuff. So he wanted to have fellowship with him. And let's be honest, in our culture as well as in other cultures as well, one of the most intimate things that you can do with somebody is to have a meal with them. That's why whenever you go out on a date and you want to get to know somebody, what's the first place you usually take somebody? You take someone to a restaurant, or you take them to get coffee, or you have a shared experience with them where you can get to know them and talk to them and understand them and things like that. And there are other dates that aren't so well, and trust me, I've probably had my bad share of those as well. But we have these here, and he had this meal with him. Now, it's interesting that here in John, he mentions it's a charcoal fire. He doesn't just say fire, it's a charcoal. So now, it brings up the comparison between the charcoal fire that was built where Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Now Peter is around a fire again with Jesus and with some of the other disciples, communicating and having a meal with Jesus. So this is what we really start to see here, is that he wants this fellowship with him. And so he brought the fish. Now this is, as I said here, this is the 3rd time that Jesus revealed himself to the disciples in this part. And so then the next part, we're going to get to this other interesting part, which is it's an interaction with Peter. And it's just 2 verses, which is 15, or 3 verses, which is 15, 16, and 17. And we're going to see this. And so let's look at this real quick. So let's look at John 21, verses 15 to 17. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Lord, you know that I love you." He said to them, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Lord, you know that I love you." He said to them, "Tend my sheep." He said to them a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Here we see Peter, an interaction with Peter where Peter is, Jesus is asking Peter some questions. And to kind of, I think, to get to the point. It's one of those things where as a parent, I ask questions, but a lot of times whenever I ask questions, most of the time, or some of the time, I already know the answer to the question. I already know what's going on, and it's just to kind of see what the reaction is. Maybe that's what Jesus is saying here. Because guess what? Jesus knows that Peter denied him 3 times, right? Jesus is God. He knows everything. He knows everything that happened. But yet here we see this equivalent to this where, yes, Peter denied Christ 3 times by a charcoal fire. And here by a charcoal fire, Jesus is asking Peter 3 times if he loves him. So it's interesting that both those are 3. And it's kind of like it's to the point where, and we kind of see this as well, it's interesting because each one kind of is escalating and different. And we'll look at that here in a second. But it's funny how it gets to that 3rd time. And I don't know about you, but whenever someone asks me a question 3 times, I kind of get upset. right? Especially if it's in sequential order. And it's usually Holly, which you know, my wife. She'll ask me a question and I'll tell her, and then she'll ask me like right after, and I'll tell her the same thing, and I'll be like, I just told you. You know, it gets those. It's frustrating for us. So I'm sure it was that way and we see here that Peter was grieved. He may have been grieved because he was guilty because it's the third time he asked him, and he related and remembered back to whenever he denied Jesus 3 times. But we see that here, and so let's kind of look and dig into these. So we see the first time Peter asks Jesus. Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" He says, "Yes, I do." And then Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." The second time he asks, and Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know this." He says, "Feed my sheep." And then we see the last, take care of my lambs, tend my lambs. And then the last thing he says is after he gives him the answer that he wants, or is more he's looking for. He says, feed my sheep. So we kind of see this progression here. One thing that's interesting if you look at this, we see this is that what are the these that could be in this story? It says, "Do you love me more than these?" It doesn't say what it is. It doesn't say what it's referring to. There's pretty much only, I think, 2 things in here that it could be referring to. First, it could be referring to these other 6 disciples that are here. It's like, do you love these other 6 disciples more than me? The other thing it could be referring to, and like I said, I haven't really done a deep dive into this, but it really may seem that Jesus was preparing Peter and encouraging Peter not to go back to being a fisherman. Because it's interesting in this story is that this encounter is happening right after he's caught fish, right after he decided to go fishing. So maybe it's referring to him not to go back to his old life. Do you love me more than fishing? Do you love me more than your career? Do you love me more than those that are around you? All these things. So, it's interesting to take and look at it and think about it. Like I said, we don't know exactly what it is, but it's more likely one of those 2 things from something I read. But so Jesus asked this poignant question, "Do you love me more than these?" And Jesus is like, "Of course, Lord, I love you. Of course, Lord." And so it's almost like a flippant answer, right? And that's one of those answers where it's like an automatic answer. If someone asks you a certain thing, you're like, "Oh, yeah, I love you." Or like if someone asks you something like, "Oh, did you do this?" Sometimes you're like, "Yeah, I did it." And then you may or may not have done it, right? So that's what Peter's first answer is. Like, "Yes, I love you." It's kind of like that flippant, like automatic answer to a question. And maybe you have those when your parents ask questions. You're like, "Oh, yeah, I did it." Or, "Yeah, I'll do that," or whatever. We do these flippant answers, and they're not really sincere. And of course, Jesus kind of knows Peter's heart and what he's thinking at this moment. But the first thing he says is, "Feed my lambs." Feed my lambs. And there's the progression here to the responses of Jesus as well. We start off with feed my lambs. You think about lambs are babies. They're baby Christians, baby people, baby sheep, right? And that's maybe what he's referring to there. And then it says, the next thing he says, after he does it the second time, replies the same answer, "Yes, Lord, of course I love you." And he's like, "Well, take care of my sheep, tend my sheep." And then the third response, which is a little more in depth, which, it was upsetting to Peter because of that, maybe like I said, because he was grieved because he knew this was the third time that Jesus was asking this, and Jesus had denied Jesus 3 times. Now he acknowledges that he loves Jesus 3 times in this passage. He says to him, he says, "Do you love me?" He says to him, "Lord, you know everything and you know that I love you." So he acknowledges that Jesus was Lord, knows everything, and knows that he loves him. And he says, "Feed my sheep." Once again, there's that progression here in this. It starts off as lambs. Once again, what is he talking about? Well, Jesus always uses the metaphor of sheep and lambs and livestock and things like that to refer to the people that are that are under his care, the people, his Christians, were all his sheep. He refers to that as, throughout the Bible in that way. So he's more likely here is referring to the fact that we're getting ready so you're getting ready to start. So you got to start feeding my lambs. You got to take care of my little baby Christians as they grow up. You have to make sure they're protected, make sure they get what they need, make sure they get the doctrine they need. They understand the smaller concepts, then you move to bigger concepts, those kind of things. And the second answer is tend my sheep, take care of my sheep, kind of grow them, take care of them, prepare them. And then the last thing is feed my sheep, where you have the adults there who are feeding them. You're feeding them, giving them what they need so that they can stay Christians and stay faithful. So this is a really interesting passage here. And, we're next is going to see, here, the next part, which is verses 18 to 25 of this chapter, we see that Jesus is, the Lord of our futures, right? Jesus is the Lord of our futures. So let's read verses 18 to 25. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hand, and another will dress and carry you where you want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him, the one who also was leaning up against his back during the Lord's Supper, and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So stop saying spread abroad. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that the disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say that to him, that he was not to die. But if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is a disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now there are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Here we start to see the martyrdom. First of all, we see in the first two verses, 18 and 19, we see martyrdom predicted. We see the way in which that they're going to die. We see that the disciples here were going to have to die. And here's the truth, is that we don't understand. We don't know this through the Bible, but we see this through knowing that through church history is the way in which the disciples died. And the disciples each died in a different way. Some were stoned, some were crucified, some were burned, other things like that. And so that's what we see there. But yet we start to see this is that, you used to walk how you want to do what you want to do. Now you're following the will of God. You're following Jesus. So you're not doing the things you want to do. You're doing the things that you're supposed to do. Someone else is doing that for you. And it was going to get to the point where they were going to be correct. They were going to be martyred. We know from church history that Peter was crucified, but he was crucified upside down. He was crucified with his head towards the ground instead of his feet. And so we see these different things and know that different of these disciples were crucified and stoned and persecuted and martyred because of their faith, because of who they associated with, because they believed in Jesus. And so we see that. And then the next is we kind of start to see almost a selfishness in Peter. Once again, Peter is, as John MacArthur puts it in his book, 12 Ordinary Heroes, he names that chapter, Peter, the disciple with the foot-shaped mouth. Peter's going and putting his foot in his mouth. He's speaking out of turn. He's doing things and not speaking before he thinks, which I know is a problem that a lot of them have. Sometimes I have that problem as well. A lot of times I speak before I think things through. But we see here in this last interaction, it's really interesting. It's the interaction between Peter, Jesus, and John. Like I said, John is referred to as the apostle whom the Jesus loved. It's interesting because we see this here is that's the disciple. John is the disciple who wrote this book, right? He wrote this book, and he never refers to himself as John. I think that's one of those weird things is that we have that problem sometimes, right? We don't like to refer to ourselves in the first person, right? We don't like to refer to ourselves as John. Like I say, oh, Josh went and did this lesson on John 1. No, we don't like that. We say like I did or we did, but he doesn't want to refer to himself as I because he doesn't want to exalt himself. So he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, which he loved him because he was close to him, right? He was one of the close-knit ones in there, in the group. And so Peter turned around, saw John and Jesus talking, and it's almost like a little bit of jealousy, a little bit of selfishness coming on Peter's part. So Peter runs after him, and he stops him, and he says, Lord, what's going on? What's happening here? Why is it going on? What about this man? What about this man? And so we see here is that there's an interesting interaction between Jesus and Peter. And it's something that ended up being misunderstood. I think Peter was like, well, is John going to be the one who's going to be the leader? Because what I think it was is they were looking for leaders, right? I think Peter was wanting to be the leader. Internally. He was being selfish and wanted to be the leader. And John here is talking after this on the way back. So Peter's thinking and getting jealous that John is getting more face time with Jesus before he left. And so, he goes and he tries to interrupt him and tries to, understand and ask him. So he asks, well, what about this man? Is he going to be the leader? Pretty much is, I think, what he was asking in this passage. And Jesus was like, well, no, and he didn't necessarily say yes or no, but he gives an answer that is misunderstood and misinterpreted by the disciples, right? Because that's what we read there. He's misunderstood. So he says, if it's my will that this man stay until I come again, he will. And so the disciples that were there took that and said that that's what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying, oh, this man's going to live until I come again. This man's going to live forever. This man's going to be in charge of the church forever. But no, that's not what Jesus was saying. That's not what Jesus was saying in this passage. And so it comes down to him, because we see that that this wasn't what was written to him. It's that if he remains until I come and it's my will, that'll happen. Jesus was saying that, I have control over everything. If I want something to happen, it's going to happen. You're going to get someone who's going to come and help you guide. You're going to get someone to help you lead. It's just, if I want it to happen, if it's my will for John to live 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, it could happen. Right? Because he's Jesus. He can do whatever he wants to do. And I think sometimes we forget about that. But that's what Jesus was saying here, is that if it's his will, it would happen. But he wasn't saying that it's going to happen, but if it was what he wanted, it would happen. And so this once again goes is that we get this gossip chain going around, right? I don't know if you've ever played the game Gossip, but it's where someone tells someone one thing, then someone goes tells another thing, and it keeps on getting around. Well, that's probably what was happening here, and that's why it got to the point where it's like, oh, John's going to stay around because that's what Jesus said. It started with one thing, and it went to someone else, and it kept getting around back and back and back. And so we see that. Because it said that this disciple was not to die, but, that's not what he was saying. He wasn't saying that John wasn't going to die. It's just that if it was his will for John to be around, it was his will for John to see Jesus come back after he was resurrected, after he ascended to heaven, it could happen. And that's what we see here. And then we come to the final verse, and this really doesn't have a point, but we see this, and we like to think that we know everything Jesus talked about, and we sit here and we debate sometimes, and we have people who say things like, oh, Jesus never talked about that. Jesus never talked. Well, the truth is that we don't have every single recorded word of Jesus. We don't have every single recorded action that Jesus did in his life. And that's what John's saying here in verse 25. It says, now there are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. It's like that old song from, I can't remember what song it was. I think it's like The Love of God or something like that. It talks about at the end of, in one of the verses it says, were the pen, the sky of parchment made, and every tree on earth, leaf, limb on earth, or something a quill, and every person was writing, and the ink and all the water was ink. We would fill the sky with writings about what Jesus did. We would empty the ink we would empty all the water from the oceans if it were ink. Just that's how much Jesus did. We don't have in the Bible, we have a good recording of it, but you got to look at it. What do you do in the course of a year? What do you say in the course of a year? If you were to sit there and have someone do a transcript of every single thing you said, every single thing that you did for a year, what would that look like? What would that look like? I'm sitting here, and for a 30-minute sermon, whenever I do sermons, I shoot to be around 30, 35 minutes. And part of my sermon process is that I go through is whenever I'm preaching in front of the church, I shoot for that. And my sermons end up being anywhere from 6 to 7 pages in there. And it may be a little shorter. It depends on the spacing and all of that stuff in the margins, because I kind of got it in outlined form. But just think about that. 30 minutes worth of speaking is that. Think about how much it takes for you to read a book. Right? I'm going through a book right now, and sometimes it takes me 20, 30 minutes to read 10 pages. Right? Maybe you can read faster, maybe you can read slower. But imagine how many books it would take to fill with everything Jesus did. I have books that are thousands of pages long, but that would be even so much more than that. It would probably be more books than what's in the library if we covered everything about Jesus' life while he was here on earth. Because remember, his public ministry was only 3 years long. And so let's just take that sermon that I was talking about, 30-minute sermon that I can read, which is 6 or 7 pages. So if we took that, so that's that. Let's just make it 10 pages an hour. Right? Let's just make it easy. 10 pages an hour. For an hour to recount everything that you've said, everything that you do. And then you do 12 hours. You're looking at 120 pages for 12 hours. And let's just say we record what you do when you sleep, what you dream about, all that stuff. So you're looking at 240 pages for a day. 10 days would be 2,400 pages. 100 pages would be what? 24,000 or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's a phenomenal amount of paper if you think about it. Right? 24,000 pages for 100 days. Multiply that times 3, you're up to almost 100,000 pages for a whole entire year. So there's a lot that we don't know about what Jesus did, but we have the most important things recorded. We could trust that it's true and accurate because these are all first-hand accounts of what Jesus did. So as we go out, what are some principles that we can learn? Serving Christ with energy in the flesh alone can bring futility and frustration. And that's what was happening to the disciples, right? They were out fishing all night in their own strength, and it brought futility and frustration because they didn't catch anything. Then once they listened to Jesus, whenever Jesus does something, just do it. That's what the disciples did. They threw it down the other side, and guess what? They listened, and that's where we're flowing. They had more than what they could ever imagine. And discipleship means following Christ without asking questions about other people. Focus on yourself. Focus on yourself and not on others. When we start to follow after others, just like what Peter was doing here, seeing John and trying to follow after John, we see that Jesus rebuked him and that he really started to misunderstood what was going on. Right? And so we see that and focus on what you do and don't allow other people what other people do to dissuade you from following Christ. Just because someone who says they're a Christian and you follow them and you look after them, you look up to them, follows Christ and sins and falls away, doesn't mean that you stop following Christ. You still follow Christ no matter what, because guess what? Each and every one of us is human. Each of us makes mistakes. None of us is perfect. We just have to remember that. And we have to reject everything in our life that's not the will of God. If it's not God's will for you, if you know it's not God's will for you, don't do it. Follow God's will. Even if it's calling you to do something crazy, follow God's will. The safest place for you to be is in the center of God's will. It's safer for you to be there. Let's just say if God calls you to the deepest, darkest spots in Africa to be a missionary to people there who've never heard the gospel before. It's safer for you to be there than it is for you to be here in Thomasville at home and to be comfortable. Because God will bless and reward you greatly. And never forget, love is the centerpiece of ministry to other people. Our motto here at the church is love God, love people. Love is the centerpiece of our ministry, because if you love God with all your heart, mind, soul, body, and spirit, it's going to be easy for you to naturally flow out of love for other people, because that's what God wants. So as we go out this week, let's look for ways to love God, to love people, and do His will for our lives. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic week. If you have any questions, let me know. My email is down in the description down below. Thanks, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your week.